Leading Adolescent Literacy Leadership. I'm Brenda Warren, President of the Reading League Vermont, and I'm excited to see all of you here. We have a very interesting presentation today that I think you'll learn a lot from. Our chat will be open for you to ask questions during the presentation, and we will have some time at the end to answer those. Also, I will be putting in some information in the chat about some events and resources related to the Reading League Vermont. The one I want to highlight is we are having an in-person event, an in-person meeting on August 19th from 10 to 12 at the Stern Center. We're hoping to see many of you there so we can get your ideas and get to know each other better and figure out how the Reading League Vermont can better serve our Vermont educators, parents, and literacy advocates. If you're unable to attend, we would still like to hear your thoughts. And so there will be a link in the chat so you can just fill out that survey, but indicate that you're not coming. But please register if you plan to come so we can make plans for how many are coming. At the end of this presentation, we will share a link to a survey, another survey you can fill out that will, and you'll get a certificate of attendance. That link will also be in an email that you'll receive today that has a recording and PowerPoint of today's presentation. And now I'm pleased to introduce and welcome our speech language pathology team of Kara Arduengo, Emily Detzer, and Jennifer Conforti. Take it away.
Thank you, Brenda. Our presentation today is about school systems to address students' speech, language, and reading needs. I am Kara Arduengo, and I am a speech language pathologist at the New School in Montpelier. I have been a speech language pathologist in Vermont for several years at different school systems. I've worked at Milton Middle School, and I've worked at Barry Town School, to which I'm returning for this next year moving forward. So we're going to offer the perspective of speech language pathologists on this topic of adolescent literacy systems. So I'll let Jennifer and Emily introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Conforti. For the last 3 years, I've worked as a speech language pathologist at Brewster Pierce Memorial School in Huntington, Vermont. In Vermont, I've also worked as an SLP in the Middlebury Addison Central Unified School District. I worked there with students aged kindergarten through 12th grade. And I worked at Shelburne Community School with middle school and elementary students as an SLP, and also as a literacy interventionist. Prior to becoming an SLP, I worked with students who were English language learners, and I also had a time teaching English, middle school, high school, and community college. So I have sort of a wide, diverse history in language and literacy instruction.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emily Detzer. I'm a speech language pathologist at Edmonds Elementary School in Burlington, and I'm about to start my 13th school year as an SLP, and I've also worked at a variety of schools in Vermont, New York, and Virginia.
Jennifer and Emily are also board members of the Vermont Speech Language Hearing Association, known as VISHA. And there's a link here on this image to visha.us, their website. And we encourage anyone to contact VISHA, which is an organization set up to advocate for and support SLPs and audiologists here in Vermont. So it could be a great place for follow-up questions and further resources. Today, our presentation has 4 learning objectives. First, participants will identify the expertise of school-based speech language pathologists in literacy instruction and evaluation. Second, participants will identify common terms for speech and language disorders and explain co-occurrence with reading disorders. Third, participants will state connections between speech, language, and literacy skills. And last, participants will name multiple ways SLPs can contribute to educational support teams, EST, and multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS. So often, speech language pathologists are referred to as just speech teachers, or often a common way that student services are referred to is going to speech. However, SLPs can offer schools so much more than just brief one-on-one speech services. The language piece of speech language pathologist is actually an even bigger part of our practice, encompassing several different areas that you'll learn about today. And the pathologist piece is actually also important because it indicates that we can evaluate as well. So the speech part is how we say sounds and words. Speech includes articulation and how we move our mouth and articulators to make sounds. It also includes voice and whether we have enough breath support, whether our vocal folds are hoarse. And finally, it includes fluency and the smoothness and rate of our speech. And an impediment in fluency can be known as a stutter. There is also cluttering, which more includes collapsing of syllables and confusion in speech organization. So other terms for other speech disabilities that aren't as much on the language side can include speech sound disorder, phonology or articulation disorder, speech impediment, speech impairment, speech delay, or apraxia and dysarthria are more motor speech disorders. Language, on the other hand, occurs more in the brain rather than the mouth. So it refers to the words we use and how we use them to share ideas and get what we want. So language includes the content of what words mean. Some words have more than one meaning. It also includes the form, how we make new words and how we put words together. Morphology and syntax, which we'll talk about more later. And finally, language includes use of language, what we should say at different times. That can be referred to as social communication or pragmatics. So if a student has a language disability, they might be referred to as a late talker. It may be called a language impairment, but speech language impairment in Vermont is a very difficult diagnosis to get in the schools because you have to be in the bottom second or first percentile for Vermont regulations, which we're currently working on. So it may be that a student who actually does have a language impairment may be diagnosed instead with a specific learning disability, which is why SLD is on there. And we'll talk more about developmental language disorder, DLD. And this is really becoming much more commonly used now in the research and is a focus for SLPs currently, but it hasn't really caught up into mainstream school lingo in Vermont. But developmental language disorder is again brain-based and it's developmental. And it's focused on making understanding language difficult and expressing using language difficult. It can cause and co-occur with other academic and social emotional difficulties. So indicators of developmental language disorder are problems with word finding, problems expressing oneself thoroughly and completely, talking about events and sequencing events, problems answering questions and understanding information in class, following directions, particularly if they aren't routine or with visuals. It can also, again, co-occur with problems paying attention, problems socializing and understanding what peers are meaning, and problems with written language, meaning the reading and writing part of language. There is a great resource about developmental language disorder down in the corner. This is a hyperlink to the website DLD and Me, which is a really parent-friendly, layperson-friendly site. So it's estimated that up to 7% of children school age meet criteria for developmental language disorder. And those students are 6 times more likely to have reading difficulties than typically developing peers. Um, Similarly, on the other side, at least half of the children with diagnosed reading disabilities will also have developmental language disorder. So that language piece does have a greater impact on reading, comprehension especially. But the speech part, speech sound disorders, do impact spelling and phonology skills, phonological awareness, if that speech disorder is present past preschool, especially. So that can also impact word reading skills and automaticity in decoding longer words.
All right, so the question that we're presenting is, how can SLPs help? We have a large body of knowledge now that supports the connection between the development of oral language and the development of literacy, as well as the connection between disordered oral language and or speech and disordered reading and writing skills. And SLPs do have background that can help schools by providing services and support for literacy development. So the slides that I'll be presenting next, the next several, have a bit of reading to do. So I'm just going to pause here and give you a moment to read the text on the slide. And F-35 is going overhead my house right now, if you can hear that. Okay. Um, so some of what the research is showing us, and I think we knew this already, is that prevention is effective and early intervention is effective, and that we can help in the early stages of literacy development before a disorder can occur, that we can help stave off um, learning difficulties by front loading instruction for more students rather than those that have already reached a period of intense difficulty, one that's so intense that it prevents them from fully participating in their education and needing IEP services, which is traditionally where SLPs have served for children who are already needing an IEP. Also, SLP intervention for language can help globally. It can help students all around, especially during early intervention and helping meet students' speech and language needs at an earlier stage. Research is also suggesting that during therapy sessions with SLPs that we don't only focus on oral speech and language, but that we also introduce reading and literacy tasks in that intervention to help bridge the connection between oral and written skills. And finally, that SLPs are especially qualified for phonological awareness activities and exercise and instruction. And we take whole classes in our graduate programs around phonology and speech sounds. And we may come with a base of knowledge that teachers may not get through their teacher education programs. And utilizing our expertise can make a significant improvement in literacy. So now that this research is becoming more prominent schools are starting to understand the value of what we can provide. And we're being charged now with becoming more involved in the instruction of reading, and literacy is part of our scope of practice. Our scope of practice is primarily determined by ASHA. ASHA stands for American Speech Language Hearing Association. They are not they're not really our governing body to practice. That's the state, but they set the criteria for us to get our C's, which is the Certificate of Clinical Competency, and they place requirements upon us for our professional development and our scope of practice. So this is their position statement regarding our role in literacy. Again, I'll give you just a moment to skim this slide. Traditionally in schools, there's been quite a separation, and this is my experience here in Vermont at all the districts I've worked at. There's a pretty clear delineation between the responsibilities of SLPs and teachers, or SLPs and literacy interventionists. And my experience has been that SLPs primarily work with just oral language, and we don't do too much with literacy because that's the realm of the literacy interventionist. However, this is, I think, starting to change a little bit through the MTSS model, which I'll talk about in just a moment. Okay. And ASHA continues to stress the connection between spoken and written language. I'll give you a moment to look at this slide. Oral language is the foundation for written language. If there's a weakness in a student's listening ability or speaking ability, there will almost definitely be a correlated weakness in written language, either reading or in writing. And Kara talked about already the comorbidity of difficulties that occur with oral and written language. And the research of ASHA and the position of ASHA supports that connection as well. And takes the position that when there's a growth in oral language, there will be a growth in written language and vice versa. Now, coming from our national position through ASHA down to Vermont, Vermont has, for us to get our endorsement through the AOE for speech language pathology, our endorsement includes competencies and standards, just as teachers have their standards for their certificates and license. And AOE is really beginning to recognize our expertise in language acquisition and disorders. And so they include it in our licensing standards. Again, I'll give you a moment to skim this slide. SLPs come to schools with an expertise in how a language disorder may impact the acquisition of literacy. So we can collect a lot of data about students' literacy through, like screeners or tests like STAR or something else. But getting down to the specifics of why a student may score the way they score or have the particular difficulties they're having SLPs might be able to offer some sort of insight that the rest of a team may not be able to offer. So they can be valuable collaborators, also in the design and the implementation of literacy instruction. For example, they can help districts to choose a literacy program by taking a look at the curriculum and determining if it's sufficient to meet the needs of students who may have difficulty with phonological awareness or reading comprehension. And as I mentioned, they can help analyze data after assessments to find where holes might be in instruction for particular students. So I think as many of us know, Vermont is a proponent of the MTSS system, multi-tiered system of supports, which promotes the constant reassessment of student progress and the ability of different adults in the building with different expertise being able to work with all students, not just students on an IEP, not just students on an EST plan, but all students in general education. And at this time, Vermont's goal is for SLPs to fully integrate themselves into the MTSS system. This has historically been a little bit difficult, I think, because we've become really accustomed to SLPs working with students on an IEP in the speech room, and it's a mold that is difficult to break. Funding could also be an issue. For example, if an SLP's if their salary is paid for strictly out of special education funds, there may be some difficulty in making the case that those funds would be used for general education purposes. So there are a few different factors why it may be hard to fully integrate SLPs, but it is the goal of the AOE, and VISHA also supports this integration. So what's the role of SLPs with MTSS framework? Primarily at this point, we may focus on managing referrals and screenings to identify students with weak speech or language skills. And we can provide instructional support that could either look like giving direct intervention services through Tier 1 or Tier 3, or through consultation or collaboration with general education teachers. That's more of a Tier 1 service through MTSS. Okay, next slide. When the AOE was rolling out their MTSS process and trainings, we asked for a little bit of help as SLPs. Where do we fit into the system? And the AOE was responsive to our request for help and worked with us and various other SSPs to design a tool that would help us think about how our services are being used in schools. So SSPs are other specialized service providers. We're included, audiologists are included, OTs, PTs, school psychologists, nurses, counselors, and social workers. We all work with students, but not directly as special education teachers. And so what role do we all play in the MTSS system? So this tool is sort of set up, to me, it reminds me of many instructional rubrics or frameworks like the Charlotte Danielson or the Robert Marzano. We have performance indicators on the left, and what these effective practices might look like. Sorry, the second column, this is the one that's most interesting to SLPs as service providers. There's a third and even a fourth column that we cut off for the purposes of this presentation. But the question is, okay, how do we make our services work within a school district given sort of the confines of how we've worked previously and just the way school systems are designed. So this is a document, it's on the AOE website. There's a link to it. Visha has worked on giving some training for SLPs, and we've invited other folks too, like special services directors to participate. But this is something that Visha's actively working on, is using this tool to assess our own systems within our schools and make changes for best practice. So this tool can be used for writing professional goals or for evaluating ourselves at the end of a school year. Okay. So mentioned on that last slide was one of the primary ways that we can become more integrated in the MTSS system and support all students is through a clear referral process. So on this slide, you'll see an example of a referral form. This is my personal form from Brewster Pierce Memorial School, and I designed it on Google Forms. So it's an easy document for teachers to fill out, parents to fill out, other adults in the building to fill out, to refer students, and it creates a systematic, trackable way of identifying needs. So we want to make sure that our school systems and our school teams have a clear understanding of how to refer students for either consultation or training. The process should be very clear and very equitable. So again, you might consider using a digital form. And referrals may also come from SLPs or within team meetings. Some schools invite SLPs to every EST meeting when determining if a student should qualify for an EST, or ongoing meetings to look at student progress over time if they're on an EST plan. And also professional learning communities, involvement in those teams can be so valuable, especially when teachers are looking at data of student reading progress or student sample work writing. SLPs can just give a little bit of a different perspective in analyzing that data. Okay, next slide. Screenings, universal screenings are also something that AOE and Visha support. Already at many of the grades, there are already universal screenings set in place that occur regularly: STAR, other reading assessments, their writing assessments. But schools have not been yet so consistent about language assessments. And because we know that oral language and written language skills are so connected, we are really arguing that we need to have more regular screenings for oral language as well, especially at the younger grades, preschool, kindergarten, and especially at transitional times when students are going from preschool to elementary or elementary to middle. It's great for SLPs to be involved in gathering information about pre-literacy skills, especially like phonological awareness. And our screenings might be a little bit different. They might be really divorced from letter recognition, orthography, reading, etc. Really looking at those foundational pre-literacy skills. Okay, next slide. And what we're looking for in our screenings when we talk about language separate from speech, we're talking about phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Those are the 5 areas of language that we're looking for strengths and for weaknesses. These strengths or weaknesses will likely correspond to the strengths and weaknesses that students are presenting with in reading fluency and comprehension. This table, I like this table because it shows the correspondence of oral language to written language, but also the reciprocal relationship between the two receptive areas of language, listening and jumping over to reading, and the reciprocal language or relationship between speaking and writing. Those are the two expressive areas of language. So this can be a helpful table to come back to later. But Emily is going to go into depth about each of these areas of language.
So as we go through each area, we're going to talk about challenges that you may encounter in each area, as well as what SLPs can do to help. So we're going to start with phonology. Phonology refers to the speech sounds of a language. We want to think about how children produce speech sounds, as well as how they perceive speech sounds. Challenges may include mixing up or omitting sounds when speaking. Some examples of that may be a student saying canny for candy, never for never, or nothing for nothing. A particular area of challenge is consonant blends, speaking, reading, and spelling. So some examples for that might be a student reading black for the word black. And then in spelling, if a student's trying to spell lamp, they might spell it as lap. Or class, they may spell it as cass, and that's showing that they're not perceiving each individual sound within that consonant blend. Longer words also pose a specific challenge to students in the area of phonology because of how many individual speech sounds are in longer words. So students may omit syllables when they're reading or spelling. An example of that would be the word reasonable being read or spelled as reasonable. So what can SLPs do to help? We can select and administer articulation and phonological awareness screenings. We may provide short-term interventions for students with speech sound errors as part of an EST process. We may refer for evaluation if we think that there's evidence that the student would meet criteria for a speech impairment. We can consult with teachers to analyze phonological awareness and word reading tests, especially after we've completed a screening or if a student has an IEP. We really know what kinds of speech sound errors they're demonstrating, and we can help interpret the results so that they're accurate. We can help generate phonological awareness goals, especially those that teachers are working on directly with students. As Jennifer was saying, we have, a real depth of information regarding the classifications of speech sounds as well as their development over time. And some students may need a more honed in approach, such as working on continuant sounds before stop sounds with their phonological awareness instruction. So we can consult on instructional strategies for phonological awareness and spelling, and we can really educate teams on the relationships between speech sound errors, phonological awareness, reading and spelling errors, as well as the co-occurrence of challenges in those areas. The next area is morphology, which is the structure and form of words in a language, including how words change to show different meaning. So challenges might include pronoun usage, like her going to the store. Verb tenses are particularly challenging. When we consider like the simple word go, it can change in a variety of ways to show tense, such as I will go, he goes, they went. Children may struggle with function words, so those little words that help act like the glue to keep our sentences together. Kids may be skipping word endings when they're reading or speaking. When we add suffixes to the ends of words, that often causes a challenge for students who have phonological challenges or articulation challenges. So an example of that would be like a student trying to say walked. It might be difficult for them to say that final t sound, or the word tenths. That requires a lot of co-articulation between the n, the th, in the S sound. Students may also have poor phonological awareness or poor morphological awareness and may just not be paying attention to those endings and why they're important for meaning. We may also see that writing samples lack many grammar structures, so that would be another challenge to look for. So SLPs can administer language screenings to look for those grammar and morphological awareness challenges. The SLS is a student language scale, which is a commercial screener, and it's a quick teacher form. The SELF-5 is a common commercial language screening that many of your SLPs will have. And then another assessment tool or screening tool that I don't think that we use enough is language sampling. So SLPs can listen and record conversational language samples or a story retell language sample. And the MISL stands for Monitoring Indicators of Scholarly Language. So this is a research-based tool to progress monitor language skills, including grammar and verb tenses. So given that screening information, SLPs may determine that short-term interventions might be appropriate, or they might determine that a student possibly needs an evaluation for a suspected language impairment. We want to be collaborating with teachers if they're noticing particular grammar errors in written language samples, and they kind of want an idea about instructional strategies and what they can do to help. We can offer progress monitoring tools. And a big part of our job is also educating teams about English learners. So when we're noticing what teachers might think of as errors, it could in fact be just where the child is at with their English language proficiency development. So an example of that would be Spanish speakers who are learning English often have difficulty distinguishing the ways to pronounce ed for past tense verbs, and they may also have difficulty with S for plurals. So the SLP can bring their knowledge of languages that are different than ours to be able to determine, is this a language difference or is it really a language learning disability? So syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to create well-formed sentences. Challenges may include speaking in short, choppy sentences, limited use of conjunctions that really limits the sentence length, as well as like the complexity of the student's abilities to relate more complex ideas. In addition to having challenges in using longer sentences, kids may struggle understanding longer sentences. And what we know about text and academic language is that there's a lot of syntactic structures that are very different than just conversational speech. So we want to be thinking about those types of more complex sentence structures and how more challenging it is to understand those if you have a language disability. We may notice that some students are not pausing at phrase boundaries or at the end of sentences while they're reading, and that really shows that they're not understanding those syntax areas and boundaries, which could lead to poor reading comprehension. And as many of us know, if you're not able to understand what you've read, you're not going to be able to rephrase or paraphrase what that text said. So we want to be thinking more about sentence complexity, and that's an area that that often goes unnoticed or not addressed. So how can SLPs help? We can help select, create, and administer language screenings. A really easy, quick screening tool for sentence complexity is a sentence repetition task, where students will repeat longer and more complex sentences, and SLPs can determine if they're able to, receptively hear that, then express it in what syntactic structures are more challenging for them to process. There are also other formal tools that we can use for looking at syntax. I'm going to talk quite a bit when we're talking about tools about this cubed 3 assessment. A lot of people haven't heard of it, and it's a great new tool. So it's free, and it's a screening and progress monitoring tool from Language Dynamics, and it currently covers grades K through 8. So there's a subtest called narrative language measures, and it's a story retelling task. It measures multiple areas of language, but in terms of syntax, the subtest that you're measuring, that is called sentence complexity. I've talked about the MISL before. That evidence-based language sampling rubric has areas for coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. And the Self-5 screening test, which is that commercially available test that lots of SLPs have, also looks at syntax. So in addition to completing a screening, work samples are a great way to get some information about kids' understanding of sentence structure. So we can collaborate with teachers to analyze writing samples, thinking about sentence complexity. And with those pieces of information, screening and those written language samples, SLPs can determine if a classroom-based strategy may be beneficial, or if we're really suspecting a more significant issue and would refer for evaluation for possible language impairment. So syntactic skills are a strong predictor of reading comprehension gains, particularly between grades 3 and 4. So we can offer instructional strategies that teachers may not already be using that are going to help all students. So some lessons that SLPs can provide resources for would include using sentence frames and sentence starters, which is a great way to also support English learners. Thinking about the nuance of complex syntax structures receptively might be helpful to do like a picture matching task to written and spoken sentences. Sentence combining is a great evidence-based strategy, and we can also help teachers have some resources to help kids identify parts of a sentence, understand the function of those parts of the sentence, and then how to expand and make their speaking and writing more complex. So the next area we're going to chat about is semantics, which is how words, phrases, and sentences convey meaning. So challenges that you might see include explaining and inferring word meaning, learning new words, using sophisticated content-specific vocabulary. So what I mean by that is, for example, in science, a content-specific vocabulary word would be photosynthesis or osmosis. And in literature, metaphor or protagonist. And some other more sophisticated words that students may have challenges with are academic language that you hear across all content areas, but not necessarily in conversational speech. And those might be terms like complex, restrict, formulate. Signal words also occur a lot more in text and in more like conversational discourse in the classroom, as opposed to more social conversation. And signal words help transition between or connect ideas. Some examples might be therefore, similarly, and however. And then finally, we want to be thinking about multiple meaning words. So you really have to understand the context to define those words. So for example, jam, like I'm in a jam. Am I talking about what I put on toast, or am I talking about that I'm stuck? Another example of a multiple meaning word is last. I could be talking about the final activity, or I could be talking about to endure something. So there's lots of ways that SLPs can also support semantics. We can administer screenings for vocabulary and word relationship skills. Some of those might be created as a team. So for example, a word definition task would be created by a team. Maybe they're wondering how students are understanding content-specific vocabulary, academic language, or those signal words or multiple meaning words. You can create a list of the target words that you want to look at, then ask students to provide the definition and score their responses using a rubric. Some other examples of screenings or assessments would be the Cubed 3. So that's that free screening and progress monitoring tool that I mentioned. With their story retelling task, They measure the vocabulary complexity. So when the student listened to the story, as they retell it, did they notice some of those sophisticated words and use them as they retold the story? And also there's a subtest that looks at if they could infer the meaning of those more sophisticated words and then provide a definition. And the stories are great because they already have the context clues within the story. So they're standardized stories, and you can really get a sense of if the student is able to pick up new words when they're listening. The Self-5 screening test also has some vocabulary measures to get an idea about a child's word relationship knowledge. So after we've done a screening, or if a teacher comes to us with, particular concerns that they notice as a trend in their classroom, we can offer some classroom-based strategies. It might be general vocabulary interventions. So we might recommend and provide some education about tiered vocabulary. When I was talking about academic language versus content-specific words, there's a tiered system that talks about words. We may talk about how to build that academic vocabulary skill, defining key terms using resources like semantic feature analysis, which a lot of teachers might not know about. And then if there are specific challenges that we're noticing, like a student's demonstrating word finding challenges or has difficulty understanding multiple meaning words, we might have student-specific resources to recommend for those challenges. And then with that screening information and our collaboration with classroom teachers, we can refer for special education evaluations if we're noticing that a student is demonstrating more of a significant challenge with language skills. Our tests can help differentiate between receptive vocabulary skills as well as expressive. And we also have tests that specifically look at word finding skills and other semantic skills that, that others may not have in their assessment battery. So the last area of language that we're going to talk about is pragmatics. This is how context contributes to meaning and how people use language in social interactions. So challenges may include how students are interacting with text. Can they make inferences and predictions with text? Can they infer how words relate in and across sentences? Are they paying attention to the main idea, and can they summarize? Are they understanding the perspective of the character and their motivations, or the author's perspective and their intent? And in addition to text, we want to be thinking about how students are able to, use social skills in order to participate in instruction. So students may not be speaking up in small group or whole group instruction, or they may be participating in ways that's causing the group not to be able to accomplish their goal. Another frequent challenge is difficulty understanding sarcasm in figurative language. So we want to be thinking about those areas as well for pragmatics. All right, so how can SLPs help support pragmatics? We can administer pragmatic language screenings. So that cubed 3 story retell assessment that I mentioned, as students are retelling, we are keeping track of the complexity of their retell. So did they understand the main problem in the story? Can they identify how the character felt about that and the consequences? After the story, they answer inferential reasoning questions. So those are, standard pre-made questions where we can think about their inferencing and prediction skills. And the Cubed 3 also has a great rubric for analyzing a personal story generation. And we know that a lot of kids with pragmatic language challenges have difficulty relating about their own experiences in a way that they are taking into account their listener's perspective. The Self-5 screening test also has a checklist on the back page that looks at pragmatic language skills. In addition to a screening, a great way for SLPs to support social communication skills is actually observing what's happening in the classroom. And we can offer strategies that are helping how students are using social language skills to interact with text, as well as to participate in groups. and we can collaborate with teachers for creating classroom or student-specific resources for social communication skills. And again, we're, trained evaluators, and we can notice that if there are signs of a social language disability and talk to parents about that and refer for a special education evaluation if appropriate. So Kara's going to wrap up our presentation with some next steps.
Yeah, so that is a lot of information, probably a lot of it already familiar to you, but we would really encourage you to take a step to put some of this into action with the SLPs that you work with. And I really encourage you to use the tool for MTSS and specialized service providers as a starting point. Even just chatting about if you're meeting the different effective practices with the SLPs on your teams, celebrating what you are doing and identifying places that you could improve different effective practices there, maybe different meetings or changing time in SLP schedules. So you could think about an individual goal, or if your role is more district-wide, thinking about a district-wide use of SLPs on different teams, or different things to include in evaluation templates and things that will always be considered in terms of language and some of those screenings that Emily was just talking about. So there are some example goals there, and all of these links and resources are here for you to use and refer back to. We have this page of references, and then there are a lot of links embedded in the slides, especially to the different instructional strategies that Emily was just talking about. I highly recommend a lot of the syntax lessons about sentence structure, or the semantics lessons. There are a bunch of great ready-to-use activities for classrooms if you're more at the classroom level. So I think we do have a few minutes left for questions.
We did have one question in the chat already that asked if you have an overview of speech areas and whether that is more related to phonetics.
Yeah, and I think we kind of answered those as they came up. I saw those come up, and I think they got answered. Yeah, in terms of phonology, phonology is related to phonetics. And then the overview was that first slide that Jennifer talked about, and then we did get through each of the 5 areas of language. But that chart, is better suited to looking at on your own, and you can zoom in and see the relationship between spoken and written language in all those 5 areas.
And I may add one thing about speech. When we have a student that presents with a speech disorder, SLPs look closely to see if it's an articulation disorder or a phonological disorder. And that's an important distinction because if it's an articulation disorder, that usually happens just because the mouth is having some trouble making the sounds. It hasn't figured out how to make them yet, or there's something mechanically or motorically that's difficult for the muscles to move in such a way to make the sound correctly. On the other hand, a phonological awareness speech issue has a more direct link to language, in that the mouth may be able to make the sound, but the brain decides it's not important to make the sound. And reading teachers know that when we break sounds apart into, or words apart into their individual sounds, each sound is important in making meaning. So the word cat, the k, at, each of those sounds put together in that order, we create a mental image of a cat. But a student with a phonological awareness speech disorder or a phonological process speech disorder, they may be able to say all those 3 sounds, but something in their brain hasn't figured out that those sounds are important for the listener to make the meaning of the animal in their brain. So, when we talk about phonetics, we're talking about sort of the language component of it, and making sure students know the importance of the sounds to make meaning. Whereas articulation generally means they don't have that lack of awareness. That's not the problem, really. The problem's just something with their muscles isn't making the sound correctly.
Can you speak a little bit to, I know Abby Roy, when she talked about assessments, talked about, a lot of what we typically think as early elementary, middle elementary kinds of challenges she's still seeing in adolescence. Is there anything in particular with your assessments or classroom instruction recommendations, those kinds of things that would be very helpful for the secondary age students? Or is it all just sort of, you go through all of the assessments because they can be kind of at any stage?
Yes, we did try to highlight some more adolescent and middle, third through eighth grade kinds of features that are really important. For example, in the morphology section, you'll encounter many more multisyllabic words and looking at the affixes and roots. And that's a place where SLPs can really collaborate with content instructional providers and on the curriculum in terms of which Latin roots and affixes can be taught and how. So the morphology piece, and then the syntax piece becomes important in terms of the more complex sentences. And when you start having longer essays, they're all based on if you have to give a problem solution essay or a compare contrast essay, those essay level structures are based on the sentence level structures where you need those conjunctions to combine ideas to contrast or to combine ideas to link cause and effect. And so that's something that SLPs have a lot of materials and training on, specifically the development of those types of sentences. And pragmatics then and semantics, you get into more inferential thinking past third grade, and abstract thinking becomes far more important in reading comprehension and comprehension in the classroom of content. So SLPs can really help with understanding those multiple meaning words, inferences. There's a lot more about summarizing and getting to the main idea, inferring theme and different characters' perspectives. So students with more language disorders in words, and especially in pragmatics, might struggle with that abstract language that comes up a lot more for adolescent literacy.
Thank you. There is one more question that came up in the chat. And it's, when you say disorder, how do you determine what qualifies as a disorder? Because what you mentioned could also apply to regular students.
Yeah, so there's a difference
Right.
between meeting criteria for educational disability versus speech and language disorders that you might receive a diagnosis for if you go to a clinic-based setting. So school-based Vermont speech language pathologists need to consider the criteria set by the Agency of Education's special education law. And so students may actually have a speech language disability, but not meet criteria, or a speech language disorder, but not meet disability criteria in school-based settings. So we often use those terms interchangeably, but it's going to depend on the setting in terms of what criteria we need to think about. And especially for younger kids, like 5 and 6-year-olds, it is challenging to meet criteria for like a speech impairment because of the current criteria.
Okay, so we've hit the 11 o'clock mark. I want to thank everyone for coming. And I think, yeah, I was just going to say Lee's going to put a link to the survey so you can get your certificate of attendance for today. And then come back again next week on Wednesday, August 13th. Julie Brown is going to close us up with, she's an expert in adolescent literacy, so she should provide us with a lot of good information.